All right, we're going to start a little early if that's okay with everybody. Well, we may give it a minute or two. I'll tell a quick story to fill the space. Everybody gets tired of my stories, but we're going to talk about collegiate racing next. And as far as officiating collegiate racing, we several of our staff, including Justin, are actually a product of that experience. And I'll say that in the years I raced, it was probably the most fun, most exciting, and the part of racing, I felt like the team component, even though I was on some decent teams, that team component is so important. There's a lot that we can learn out of there. That said, it's a little bit different community, and as far as it has some different rules, different experiences. How you work with the athletes is and the coaches is a little bit different. So we wanted to get this group together to chat about that. Some of the reason is that we are sort of twofold. We're looking to bring officials and more officials to help to officiate collegiate races. And several of the conference directors and other collegiate folks will have asked to come up with a program to help push some of our collegiate riders and other stakeholders actually to become officials. And I think that's a great thought. We've talked about the need for newer and younger officials coming to the program. We've got a very passionate group of folks who are involved here. I'll just tell you my real quick collegiate story. I've done a ton of races over the years. And it's actually not the racing I remember, it's all the experiences. And one of my fondest memories is traveling with my collegiate team back in the 90s. And my quick story is we were going to a race in Florida, and I think we had raced a criterium early in the morning, and then we were doing a late afternoon team time trial, which is pretty typical of collegiate. And being cheap college students, we had checked out of our hotel, and we're all traveling in a 15-passenger van with a trailer. And we're in the middle of nowhere, Florida. We pull off on the side of the road in Florida, and it's about 4 hours before the time trial starts. No one's there, nothing's there. And what do college students do when they have free time? We all decide to take a nap. So, 10 guys and girls in a 15-passenger van was crowded. It was a nice day. So some people laid out on the nice side of the road in the grass. One limber guy jumped up on top of the van to get a suntan and take a nap. And about 30 minutes later, this sheriff's deputy comes flying up with their lights on behind us and pulls in, and this female deputy jumps out. And of course, we all wake up and are like, what's going on? And she breathed this big sigh of relief and said, thank God. And we're like, what's going on? She said, well, we got a call that there was a van with a bunch of dead bodies laying around it out here in the middle of the country. And I came to check it out. So that's my funny collegiate story. All right, with that said, we've got Michael, Rachel, Nick, and Justin's going to moderate this. So Justin, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take over.
Cool, thanks, Chuck. And I'll start off. Deb Schiff just sent me a private message of nothing like the experience in Philadelphia. And there was I went up there just to kind of see how the Eastern Conference was running a race. And Deb took me to get a Philly cheesesteak in Old Town Philadelphia. And let's just say it was an experience that neither of us will ever forget, involving police officers and EMS and people getting knocked out. So that's a separate story, but that's Deb and I's story. So we've got Michael Kabanchik, Nick Luther, and Rachel Markison that are going to be here to talk through some collegiate stuff. So we'll just start off by introducing each of them. Michael's a 2013 grad of Marian University, where he raced and completed an internship in running cycling events and team equipment management. He now works as their director of cycling operations, overseeing the varsity team's operations, logistics, equipment, media marketing, and more, as well as facilities and event management for the Indy Cycloplex, home of Major Taylor Velodrome, a BMX facility, and a cyclocross race, and more. He's a USAC certified race mechanic, and when not at a bike race, can be found at either the shooting range or a local brewery. Nick Luther is the SEC conference director and has been serving in that role for 4 years. He raced in the SEC for 5 years while attending Clemson University, earning a BS in chemical engineering in 2015. After graduating, Nick remained in upstate South Carolina, where he works at Sunbrella in their research and development department, and he continues to race as a Cat 1 road racer for the NGCA elite team. Rachel's path to collegiate cycling is an all too familiar path for many collegiate cyclists that don't come from a cycling background. She was a collegiate swimmer at Stephen Institute of Technology in the Eastern Conference and decided to start doing triathlons in the off season. Quickly realizing she wasn't very good at cycling, she and other teammates joined the cycling team for evening spin workouts and were soon convinced to start attending the collegiate weekends and racing in the intro categories. Rachel then moved to California for grad school and raced in the Western Conference for UC San Diego. During her time racing collegiate, she went from the complete beginner to racing in the A's, racing at track nationals, and even trying her hand at some cyclocross races. After grad school, she moved to Santa Cruz, became the Western Collegiate Conference Director, and became an official so that she could help out at collegiate events. So all three of these guys have very similar stories that they've all raced collegiately. They all have a background in it, and they all are very passionate. And one of the reasons we picked the three of them to sit on this panel today. So each of them are going to spend some time just talking through their experience, talking through what is important to them and what makes collegiate different from the rest of the sport. So Michael, if you want to start off for us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Justin. I just want to thank you guys for the opportunity to talk a little bit about collegiate, and also say that I'm pretty honored actually to be up here with two conference directors. I also want to shout out my conference director from the Midwest is on the call. That's awesome. And I am a little bit more like Justin than these two in that collegiate cycling is my paycheck. I mean, this is my day job. So I was kind of asked to share, this was framed as a little bit of good, bad, and ugly about collegiate. And it would have probably been easy to tell some stories, maybe a little bit like Chuck's about some of the bad and the ugly. However, I'd prefer to focus on the good. So I'm going to open this up and just share some things about collegiate and collegiate programming for those of you that may not be familiar. I will say, looking through the participants list, there have been a good number of you I've been able to work with or interact with at events. And that's pretty cool. So the three primary things that stick out to me about collegiate cycling are: one, there exists a great diversity in the sport, the athletes, the teams themselves, and I'll talk a little bit about that diversity. And then also, actually, this was a twofold point, that collegiate provides this, when we're at collegiate races, provides this opportunity to constantly zoom out and look at something larger. So on the diversity front, some of you may or may not be familiar, but there exists both varsity and club teams, far more club teams than varsity ones. I work for a varsity program. We typically do things a little bit differently and typically do them on a larger scale than the club team. So it's not 10 guys in a van like Chuck talked about driving to a race. We travel in a little bit of a different manner. But that diversity right there, right? So on our team, we have riders from all over the world and of all different ability levels, literally from those that maybe have a background in a different sport, like Rachel, and my background actually is in triathlon as well before I got into cycling, or soccer, or something else where they're nursing an injury and they are truly novices, all the way up to, I don't have World Tour professionals on the team right now, but pro Conti riders for sure. And in all five disciplines, so collegiate encapsulates track, road, BMX, cyclocross, and mountain bike. Our program is one of the few that focuses wholeheartedly on all five. There's only probably 5 teams doing that. And then a bunch of other varsity teams that are focused maybe on 2 or 3 of those. But that diversity of riders of all ability levels with different focuses and then totally different experiences and a vast variety of experiences is something that's super cool. And there exists at the varsity level this bigger investment by universities to do collegiate racing for the marketing that comes from it, and as a retention and recruitment function. So here at the university, we talk about heads and beds, right? That's why the collegiate program has value. And then the other thing about diversity that I wanted to mention is and a big part of why I love collegiate cycling is it's one place in the sport, actually one of, I think, a few places in collegiate cycling or in collegiate athletics where men and women have an equal spot at the table in terms of scoring. So at every level, from conference racing to national, and then of course the team omnium, which I'm going to talk on in just a minute, both scores from both genders count. And that's crucially important. A team can have A team could go to collegiate nationals with 10 Pro Tour men and go 1 through 10 in the road race and the crit. And if they have no women, they will likely not even be on the podium as a team in that event. So it's a really cool thing. We talk often about how important it is to have a balanced team. And our goal here is to someday, and it's been a work in progress, but to have a team that is 50% men, 50% women. And I just don't really think there are many places in athletics as a whole, definitely in cycling, where that exists in that way. One of the coolest things, speaking specifically of races, Chuck, you mentioned team time trials. That's an awesome thing we have in collegiate that doesn't exist too many other places in the sport. So those of you who work a collegiate bike race, the TTTs are a really cool thing. It's something that most teams take very seriously. We certainly do. All team events. And I wanted to touch on this fairly specific thing that exists in collegiate, which are co-ed events. So at track, we do a collegiate, I think it's called the collegiate sprint now, Italian pursuit it used to be called, but it's a 6-lap race, regardless of the length of the track, a 6-lap race where 2 laps have to be completed by a female rider. We also do a co-ed team relay at mountain bike and cyclocross nationals. So those events also occasionally will happen at regional or conference events, which is a pretty cool thing. And again, men and women racing together, even in an event. We take that very seriously on a performance level, but it's also just probably one of the coolest things that I think exists in the sport. So my second real focus is to talk about how when you're scoring as an official, and I do have some officiating experience as well, I think Justin said that, when you're scoring a race, you have a collegiate rider, and without getting into the details of points tables and everything, when a rider has a result at a race, let's say we're at a collegiate mountain bike race weekend, and this is the cross country race, and a rider is 20th, and he's the 3rd rider for his team. He might be disappointed in that result. It might not seem like it matters very much, of course, but I just want to kind of zoom out for what that looks like for the team. So if whether they're club or varsity, that individual rider's result is a part of several different categories, A, B, C, and D riders, men and women, of course, who are scoring on that race weekend. And that team might be looking to have potentially won their weekend, right? That's one weekend in a handful of conference races that happen over the course of a 2-month season, say. How they do in those races determines how they finish as a conference, potentially as conference champions in the mountain bike discipline. And then in club, that result qualifies them for a certain number of spots, start spots at collegiate nationals. That varsity has a start requirement too, but so then that gets that team to nationals. Okay, the team competes at nationals. Again, it's a collection of race results, but really it's team scoring that gets that team a placing in an event and ultimately a placing at the entire championship as a team. That team, let's say, wins mountain bike nationals. It doesn't even really stop there. Collegiate has the Omnium, which is a collection of the team scores from all 5 national championships. And again, speaking solely from the varsity perspective as an athlete and a team director now, that Omnium is our real driver. And it's easy to lose sight of kind of the individual things that go on. It is bike racing, of course. The bigger mission of collegiate cycling is really to have our students walk across the stage, and the human development that goes on of collegiate athletics as a whole. But on the racing front, it's a little bit easy to lose track sometimes of those smaller things that exist throughout the course of a season that contribute to what our big goal is and are really our big driver every year competition-wise. As the Omnium, the team Omnium. So those are the good things. Those are the highlights. Those are why I'm so passionate about collegiate cycling. In terms of the bad and the ugly that we also were asked to touch on, I just want to share a couple stories. Those of you who may not be familiar with collegiate, and it does depend on what part of the country you're in. Rachel's on the West Coast, where I'm pretty sure it's 75 and sunny all the time. I'm here in the Midwest, where it's 3 degrees and there's snow on the ground. We often go to road races in like mid to late February. And that often means they are cold and kind of nasty out. And that a lot of race directors probably wouldn't consider having events then, but in collegiate, whether those races are put on by club teams or varsity teams, they do exist. And we actually had I think this was 3 years ago, our Midwest Conference road championship, regional championship, which was, I believe, in mid to late April. Brian Garfield, our conference director, like I said, is on. He could check me if I'm wrong, but I think we had 3 inches of snow just during the crits. I mean, in the like 6 hours it took to run the criterium. So certainly not the most pleasant of situations. I also will never forget this was while I was on the team, a Midwest Conference cyclocross championship that took place in a cornfield in the middle of Ohio. There was no running water. There was no electricity. It was very cold. It was snowing. Mud was freezing to the bikes. I mean, I look and I think it probably wasn't actually a very safe event given how it was produced. But that's kind of the trade-off of collegiate, is that occasionally many of you will probably be asked to officiate some of these events that are not as well produced as some of what you might be used to. And that's reflective of that diversity, like I said, that exists. We've certainly, as a team, refused to participate in a handful of events when we felt like they weren't safe. And it actually really sucks to get back on the bus and tell the students, well, we're going home, but it's not in your best interest to race because there's ice in the corners of the crit and it's just not going to work out. So those are just a handful of stories, not to scare anybody away, but if you haven't had a chance to officiate a collegiate event, I highly encourage it, because you'll get a view of, like I said, that diversity that exists, and just some very very different things and some very unique things that exist because there are students who are racing their bike as a part of a team while they're doing school. So that's all I have. I'm going to hang on to answer some questions, I think, after the other two speak. And I'm also going to drop my email address in the chat if anybody wants to get in touch.
Cool. Thanks, Michael. And my wife is sitting beside me just off camera, and she's also an official. And she just made the comment after Michael said, if you haven't had the opportunity to work, definitely try. That it's her favorite races to work. It's just a passion that everybody shows. And whether it's the A rider or the D rider finishing in last, everybody wants to be there and has a passion to do it. So I believe Rachel's going to go next. No, Nick's going to go next. So Nick.
Hey, so just like what Michael said, I'm really appreciate Chuck and Justin inviting me to speak with everybody, because collegiate cycling is something that's been just one of the biggest passions of my life. As Justin had said, this is not something that is my day job. I don't get paid to do this. Rachel and I and all the other conference directors across the country, this is something that we volunteer to do. And it's because of, the experiences that we had that, we can pass on to, to other riders. When I took on this position, it was, I was just starting my full-time job after school and kind of getting settled. And then I heard that the SEC conference director was, kind of moving on. He had served his time. And it was at that point that I was like, well, I've always been close with the conference director. I've always been close with the conference, and I don't know how we're going to move forward if somebody doesn't step up. And so right now where collegiate cycling is at, I think it has been, focused in on by USA Cycling as, the place where we can grow. And it's because of, the people that make up collegiate cycling. They're varsity riders that are, going to school on scholarship. And they're also, club riders that, are looking for something to fill their time at school, or they had a parent that was into cycling and now they want to, do that at college, or they had a friend that was really interested in it. Most of the time, what we have found is that it is a close friend or mentor or an injury that brings people into collegiate cycling. They seldom times were individuals that were racing all through high school or middle school. And so now we feel like we can take the group of people that are already passionate about it and then bring in, as we see an increase in kids finding like NICA as something that's an option for them. When I was racing, that wasn't available. You didn't have high school cycling other than being on an U23 team. And so the kids that show up at our race weekends, I'll never forget my experiences with officials like Judy, where, you're a category D rider, you're new to school, you're new to bike racing, and that's, all you have is like, well, what do I do? Like, I'm at a bike race. And so it's officials like everybody on this call that is going to set the precedent for their entire experience and feelings toward USA Cycling. And I'm sure you've all heard that before, that you are generally the, face of USA Cycling. And outside of myself and, conference directors like Rachel and coaches like Mike, the official representation that everybody on this call is bringing is not just one of like the calm and patience of, well, these are the rules and this is how you race, but you're also looked at as somebody that knows, how you go, from the ins and outs of the day. And so one of the things, outside of like just being that face, for collegiate cycling and the passion that these riders have, there are the little nuances that, that come up, like Mike was talking about there, every person who shows up to race or just ride, they're not there for the money. They're not there, generally for the hopes and aspirations of like, at least on the club side, they're not there to be professional racers. They're there because it's something that they're friends and it's something that they want to do. And so in my conference, I have roughly half of the varsity schools in the country. And we also have, the other half of my conference is made up by club riders. And so working with, folks like right now I have, 2 athletes that just got onto rally, two female athletes that'll be, huge successes, I think, for their professional careers. And they came out of collegiate, and there are so many stories of athletes that come out of the collegiate program and continue on to bigger and better things in the cycling world. And we see so many, officials that have, at least who I know that have come through, and because they were close with collegiate, they are now, they want to be a part of that next step. And so I think like just that was my pitch on like why is collegiate so different. It's because of that passion and because of like the involvement that everybody has, whether it's a new rider or an experienced racer. Everybody is important and everybody is showing up to the weekend with that same like drive. And so I guess my next thing that I would like to talk about is the differences that you would kind of experience. As Mike had alluded to, there are some real, not just on the scoring side of things, but, the events that we have. We had talked about just the TTT being something that you'll only generally see at a collegiate event, but we also have, like on the mountain bike side of things, dual slalom events, which for me, when I was just coming into, I've never raced a mountain bike before. And my only experience with being at a mountain bike race is on the officiating side of things. So learning how to score a dual slalom event, which is essentially, a 2-up time trial, and figuring out how do you, time the difference and what is the max difference between riders supposed to be. There are like some really intricate rules and experiences that you would have with a dual slalom event, or even, some of our downhill races are, unique in their setup. So one of the things that I think is important for us to look at when we're going into race weekends is making sure that we're familiar with those separate rules and those separate requirements for athletes. And I've generally tried to work with each of the officials that are, that are at my events to make sure that everybody's on the same page. If, we're all hiking, a mile to the start point for the downhill, then that's something that we've got to figure out, like, how are we going to manage top and bottom? Because cell phone service is not going to happen in the middle of the woods in North Carolina. So these are all things that, like, going into a race weekend, you may not have ever, experienced before. And it's sometimes it's the best fun because you can hear, my favorite experience is at Lee's McRae, the downhill, and you can just hear the noise and the sounds. You would assume that you were at a Red Bull event. Like, after the kids finish their run, they run back up to the drops, and you can hear them and see them cheering for each other. And that's another thing too, is that the camaraderie, is something that is just so unique. I will always look back on my collegiate experience and think about the time that you spend with that team, and then your whole conference. And when you're at nationals, it's not just, you versus everybody else in the field, but like, you're now there with people that you have raced with all season long, and that's kind of like your family. And I think that is something that does, even as I've moved on to the elite levels, I think back to collegiate as some of the most organized racing I've ever been a part of, because you just have the team points, you have the team racing tactics, and then even at a bigger level, just the camaraderie between people. Sure, people get, hot and heavy, just like any sort of competitive bike racer would, but the support is there. And that's what makes collegiate so fun, is that it's not, even if there is, like, I've made mistakes as an official where I've added an extra lap to the bell lap accidentally. And I will always remember the people that have come up to me after that and said, you really, messed up on that one. And I was like, yep, I did. But it's not somebody completely cursing you out and losing it. It's just everybody respects that it's grassroots racing. Everybody is learning. And I think that if there are new officials here, then you will appreciate, at least for me, it was, everybody came in with the understanding that collegiate is where people learn to race their bike and learn to ride. So I don't really know if I have anything else to add, so I will pass off the baton to Rachel.
Okay.
Thought I clicked unmute there.
Okay.
Thanks, Nick. That was great. And I'll just highlight one of the things that Nick had said on, as officials at collegiate races, you are likely going to be the first interaction with USA Cycling that most of these riders have. Collegiate, outside of juniors and NICA right now, collegiate is usually where a lot of these riders get their start. They pick up a bike in college, so that first interaction with USA Cycling is you as an official, and we just want to make sure it's a good one. So we'll pass that along to Rachel.
All right. Right. So as Justin mentioned, I'm the conference director in the Western Conference, so covering most of California. And I now officiate, which I love doing, but I did race in both the Western Conference and on the Eastern Conference. So the way I wanted to kind of frame my portion is by starting with kind of the bad or the differences that you might encounter working a collegiate race, and then hopefully at the end with some of the good, convince you that it's still something you definitely want to try out. And I have to say, I'm loving all the chat with the support for collegiate racing. That's great. So I think, and this is all coming from a California perspective where I've been officiating, but I think a big thing to remember with collegiate racing is that the organization is low for the most part. These are mostly student-run races, and there's not really money involved, right? So a lot of our races are break even, and that's because registration fees get kept low so that it's affordable for students. So, there might be a little bit of profit, there might be a little bit of loss, but students are putting on the races because it's part of the greater good. It's a service to the other schools, right? If every school puts on a race, then you know, our conference can have a season. You know, the races, there might be a promoter. They might have partnered with a real promoter, someone who has experience, but they also might not have. So that's one thing to remember. And I definitely encourage people to, you know, try officiating collegiate races, but you want to think about coming in with an open mind and being flexible. So some of the differences with there not really being a lot of money involved, the way you get paid might not be what you expect, right? You might be getting cash from the cash box. Someone might not be giving you a check. You might be getting a bunch of 5s and 20s. You might have to fill out extra paperwork to get paid by a school. You might not get paid exactly on time, although at least in our conference, we're working on this. So those are kind of some, you know, something to be aware of. Definitely not, you know, not a reason not to officiate, but just something to expect. Another big thing that I think about when I think about collegiate racing is I don't necessarily want to say you might need to bend the rules, but you might need to really use your judgment in which rules really need to be enforced with collegiate. So for example, if 2 teammates are wearing jerseys that are clearly from the same school, but are slightly different designs or even wildly different, you know, that wouldn't necessarily be allowed usually. But the case is probably that the school wasn't organized enough to get their new jersey order in on time. And so, sorry, laughing at the chat. And someone had to borrow a 5-year-old jersey from a teammate. You know, another thing is, like, we've talked about TTTs being a really cool part of collegiate cycling that you don't necessarily see somewhere else. You know, odds are that the school organizing the race wasn't really organized enough to get a proper start list out in time. So even if you as the official have the proper start times listed, you're going to want to be a little forgiving, right? So there's kind of this need for the officials to really use their judgment to kind of make sure that we're encouraging participation. Another example, and this is a real story, is our mountain bike weekends are usually 2-day events, and Sunday morning is the short track. So on more than one occasion, the short track first race of the day comes and there will be like 1 person there. And so, all right, clearly everyone stayed out too late partying. What do you as the official do? Well, what we've done before is waited until the second wave, raced every single category together, and it's still about 8 people. Right, so using that kind of judgment as an official is, I mean, it's fun, but it's a little different than what you might expect if you're coming at it from having only officiated at a road event. So those are kind of my, you know, my bad parts of collegiate cycling, or some of the hard parts and challenges you might expect. And I just want to give you some stories from my own experiences racing that would convince you that there's still something really awesome about collegiate racing. So my first race, as Justin mentioned in my intro, I started as a triathlete. My first race was a mile at the Philly Flyer. It was really cold. We, you know, I don't know what month it was, but probably I hadn't actually ridden on the road. I'd just ridden a spin bike. So we raced the team time trial. I'm way slower than my 2 teammates. We assume I'm just awful because we don't know. We've only been on spin bikes. We finished and it still felt like it was the tour. I mean, it was just awesome doing something with those teammates. So I was still jazzed, even though I was apparently really terrible. So I think the next race, the same day, I think they must have done the team time trial and the crit. So we're doing the crit. I'm still really slow. And one of the mentors riding in the race just pulls me over to the side gets a pump from someone, tells me my tires have been at 40 PSI, and then like eventually just pushes me back into the race. And this is not normally allowed, but this was like a great experience. I still got to finish the race. I learned something about my bike. And this was just like, you know, a really key part of me staying in collegiate cycling, right? If I contrast that to, you know, an open race 5 years later where it was a 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm a 4 and I get pulled after 2 laps, right? One of those experiences is really huge to me staying in collegiate cycling, and the other was really hard to deal with. And so I think what I want to emphasize is when you are the official at a race, you kind of have the ability to shape all these collegiate riders' experience, right? You're the one who decides if, you know, if you pull this person because they've been lapped after 1 lap, or if you're the person who just, you know, they get lapped, you pull them and you put them back in 5 different times in a 30-minute crit, right? And there's a really big difference in the experience those racers are going to have. And I mean, it's awesome witnessing the enthusiasm at collegiate races. Someone mentioned someone finishing 20th place and you'd think they won the Olympics. I mean, that's what it's like. If you ever get a chance to do a dual slalom or a downhill mountain bike race, I mean, the enthusiasm from every school for every participant is just something you don't see anywhere else. So I hope that's been a little bit convincing for any of you who haven't tried collegiate officiating, that some of that makes you want to give it a go.
Yeah, appreciate it, Rachel. That was great. And just when you're working collegiate races, just remember that a lot of these promoters may have never done this before. There may be a book sitting in their advisor's office, and within collegiate cycling, the adult supervisor could sometimes just be somebody who's never even ridden a bike before in their life. It could be somebody who just signs off on a piece of paper, and it comes from the passion of the riders themselves. So always be willing to answer the questions that you think are just absolutely ridiculous from the promoter. They may truly have that question and not have somebody who they can ask. So they're looking up to you guys as officials to be the subject expert. And then somebody made the comment on jerseys. I've never seen so many t-shirts with school names be used as jerseys as in collegiate cycling. It's completely okay. It's their team. That's all they have. Maybe they can't afford the jersey. So t-shirts are acceptable. So we'll go ahead and I've got a question for all 3 of you that if you can just take kind of in that same order. But if you were to think of one thing that you want to make sure that the officials working your race, whether as a promoter, a rider, or a coach, what's that one thing that you want your officials to be aware of? So, Michael, you want to start?
Yeah, I also want to just tag on to something Nick said, the downhill at the Lees McRae mountain bike race. We actually traveled to the Southeast to go to that race for the first time last year, whatever the last year that we had a collegiate mountain bike season. And it was being in the Midwest, we don't get to go to mountain bike events usually on that scale. And that was an amazing event, even as a varsity team, that it was bike race at the top. It was bike race at the bottom, but it was like Red Bull party in the middle, like you said. And it was a cool thing for me to run up and down, trying to give splits to some of my riders and see that. Justin, to answer your question, I think I would like to answer by just building on some of the things that Nick and Rachel already shared related to maybe it's just giving grace to certain riders or to their advisors, usually faculty members at a school who might not be bike racers themselves. And I would also share, again, offering what I have from the varsity perspective, that sometimes, and I'm fully sharing about myself in this case, sometimes the team directors or mechanics from the varsity teams probably need a little bit of grace too. I know there are some officials on this call right now who have crossed paths with me at a national championship, and I probably haven't been very nice. This is a blanket apology to all of you, but we are taking it seriously, especially at the national level, right? As an institution, we've invested in this. It is, however, not the Tour de France. And I know I lose track of that sometimes. And so, yeah, I've really enjoyed seeing all the stuff that has come through the chat just in the last 30 minutes about how unique Collegiate is, how it's different. And I guess my answer to that question would be remember what we're doing, and that remember that actually the real value in it at the highest level, but also as Nick and Rachel have shared, remember that it is an entry level point for many, and it is something that needs some grace.
Cool, thanks. Nick?
So I hate to go against that point because it is a great point and it's very valid for collegiate cycling, is that we need to remember that this is grassroots, it is entry level, but at the same time, this is the formative time. And Michael, I know you can appreciate this. This is the formative time, especially for riders that are at the top end. So I want to say we give riders that are new, and I'm sure everyone is already doing this with our Cat 5 or novice riders, is like you give them the space to learn. But at the same time, these athletes are creating impressions about what is and what is not acceptable. And this is how they can and probably will race their bikes going forward until somebody tells them otherwise. I'm sure for many, you can think back to a time where you were on one of your first group rides and somebody came up beside you and said, hey, don't do this in a corner. Don't do this while you're riding. It's not safe, or it's not, the way to race. And so the thing is that you can use this as a formative time for like new riders, teaching them skills. But I will just kind of provide this as an experience that was one of the hardest decisions for me to make. And there was an elite rider that is now moving well on into her career in 2019, and she has significantly changed from this point in her racing style and tactics. But during this race, she was, the strongest rider in our conference at the time, and everybody knew it. And she was on the front of the field, and at that point made a dangerous maneuver that compromised the safety of the entire field, and then went on to win the race. So for me to receive multiple complaints from riders and or coaches about that behavior, and then to later, pull or put that rider at the back of the field from a race win is not easy to do, but it is something that needed to be done. And it wasn't just about, we're doing this to punish you. We are doing this to ensure your professional career as you move on does not get compromised by tactics or racing style like that ever again. And I'm very happy to say that she has grown into one of the best racers I've ever seen. And I'm looking forward to her coming back and winning another national championship. But I do want to say that while there is some grace that needs to be given, I also want to remind everyone that this is a time where you can provide very valuable feedback that, could prevent, instances where, it could actually end up being bad for not just that rider, but other riders in the field.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that, Nick, and say too, remember that we're talking about racing, right? I'm very cognizant of the fact they're all bike race officials. But if I was giving a talk about collegiate racing to a slightly different audience, I probably would have focused more on, it's really, bike racing is just really not, it's not why I come to work every day. It's cool, but there's this development of student athlete, and we always talk about student first that goes on during this time, right? And so occasions like what you just shared, Nick, are just part of that development.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Rachel?
Yeah, my biggest piece of advice would be to just come prepared. Part of that's being prepared with a flexible mindset, but also just the really practical parts and realizing, like, what Nick said, if you're at a mountain bike race, you might actually be hiking to the bottom with your chair that you're carrying and your notepad. and you might need to have your spare stopwatch to give to a student you're teaching to give splits because you don't have quite enough people. So just, it might be the best practice scoring of your life working an officiate or a collegiate event, but definitely come prepared. Don't necessarily be expecting everything you might have at a really high level race.
Great point. So looks like we have about 10 minutes left. So first off, if anybody has any questions or anything, go ahead and send those in the chat. Two things that did come through, one from Ben a little while ago, just to cover on collegiate racing is covered by USA Cycling and USA Cycling alone. It's not an NCAA or NAIA sport, but a lot of our varsity teams have to follow certain regulations that are set in place by NAIA or the NCAA, as well as our club teams and our varsity teams at that, having to follow what their universities say, which sometimes makes the entire sport of collegiate cycling very difficult to manage, and we can't always just give a blanket rule because not all schools operate in the same rule set. So that's one big thing. And then let's see if I have two things that just came through. Let's see. Does anybody have any questions?
A couple of things I wanted to ask some of our presenters, Justin, and just to rely on what Justin just said, one real challenge collegiate's facing right now with COVID is there's an even stricter set of guidelines for collegiate racing now. It's not just can the race happen, it's will the schools allow their clubs or teams to travel, and that is hugely impacted the race schedule for even going into the spring. So a lot of schools are not allowed to travel, and it's unfortunate, but it's something schools are doing to be safe. So for all of you in the community, just realize that is another barrier we've got to face that hopefully is going to get alleviated sometime this summer. Question I had, a couple of things. Nick, I may send this to you because I think you experience it more, but we talked a little about club and varsity teams. And as an example, Michael is involved with one of the best varsity teams in the country. And as he pointed out, there are pro continental level riders riding for that team. And I think the budget of some of the varsity teams is as big as some of our continental teams, if not better. So Nick, we have over 20 varsity teams. You've got a lot of them in your area. Can you just give in the same sort of theme we've talked about, sort of working and what officials should expect to see with both types of teams?
Sure. So I think Rachel really hit on this kind of with her point, in that there is, when you're organizing, or when a club team is organizing an event versus a varsity team that's organizing an event, there is a level of consistent knowledge with a varsity team that's passed down or is maintained, which I think is the biggest discrepancy between varsity and club that you'll ever see, is that with club, you're getting new leadership every 4 years, if not less. So you're going to be working with somebody new all of the time. And so that is what, kind of why you're used as a reference, because you've been around, you've been to the events, you know how they work. The courses may be the same, but that intricate knowledge doesn't get passed down. So with varsity teams, the coaches generally stay around for, years upon years. And so when you work with club teams, it's, how are you getting checks paid? Where are, how do you set up a finish line? Things like that, like just simple things that you would generally assume a promoter knows how to do. That's not necessarily going to happen with like a club team that's never put on an event, which is generally why, Rachel or I are stepping in to serve as that barrier to knowledge. And with varsity teams, it's already getting done. Like, you're showing up, and most of the stuff that, they already know how to do because they've been doing it before. I will say, I have had to help plenty of my varsity teams with registration because for some reason getting that to work is too difficult, but they understand how to set up a race course. So there really is some give and take, and it really does depend upon the school. But that's, I think when it comes to varsity versus club, it's just really does depend upon where you are and how long, that leadership has been there. So.
Great, thanks, Nick. And I'll reiterate what I think Michael pointed out. I've been lucky enough to be chief at Collegiate Nationals. I've also, now that falls under me with the national championships. And I think we do have to take the national championship, especially, a little bit differently than grassroots racing. I think that's relatively fair to say. You will see team managers there, especially at the varsity level, who are as professional and are as experienced as what we see with any domestic-based team manager out there. So, for the officials, I'll just give you the bit of advice of use that feeling. And and category D riders are different than varsity riders at national championships, and that those events do need to be treated a little differently. And Nick, thanks for your advice on the formative years. I think that's really important for people to understand. The other thing I'll add, it looks like we got some questions, is the preparation for this. Everybody hit on that, and we heard it yesterday from our organizers that you need to be talking to people early, and that's even more important here. And this is one area where you probably have more experience than anyone out there as far as putting the race on. So don't be afraid to share the information and know your stuff going in. Justin is working on putting together a collegiate officiating module. One thing I learned at Collegiate Nationals, and I did some prep work before, but Sean had said it in chat, 50th place gets points. When I was there, we had a really hard road race that year, and we had to start the next race, and we had to set up an alternative finish line because we weren't going to get 50 kids in by the time the next race started. And we planned well for it and did it, but if I didn't have a background personally in collegiate racing, that would have been real difficult. We would have had problems. So there are different things, and we're going to work to help inform our officials on that. Justin, I'll hand it to you and let you follow up on any of these chat questions.
Yeah. So everybody probably saw Zach's comment of after a particularly challenging weekend, if every race was run like the Olympics, you would never learn to improve, from our Mr. Wade Schultz himself. Hopefully Wade's on. But yeah, it's a great point that if everything was as smooth as the Olympics, you would never learn and you would never improve. Ryan posed the question, what would one recommendation be that you could offer to collegiate teams to take an interest in officiating? That is one of the hardest things we have tried to figure out. I went to Appalachian State in North Carolina for 6 years between my bachelor's and master's degree. I couldn't get a single teammate interested in officiating. And it's not something that a lot of kids and a lot of students are interested in, on top of racing, on top of school. So I don't have an answer for that. If any of you guys are geniuses on that topic, I'd be more than happy to discuss that with you. But that's one of the things we've got to figure out. And I think that's one place where we could really pull from and get a pool of younger officials is the collegiate realm. A lot of these kids do stop racing after college. And if they do, how can we keep them in the sport? And officiating is that one way. So if you have great ideas there, please pass those along. And as Sean says, that's been the $64,000 question. Go ahead, Nick.
So this is something, like you said, it is the $64,000 question. And it's something that we have played around in our conference. And I think the biggest thing, as you said, Justin, is this is something that a collegiate cyclist not only has to manage on top of school, on top of their work that they may be doing to pay for school, but it is trying to get them into it because it looks like all of the collegiate cyclists, they just see what everybody, they see what all of these officials go through at open weekends. And I don't think there is a fear that is exactly what, that they're going to go through, is that it is like a bunch of negative reactions, a bunch of negative interactions with people. and that there's no giving back to officials, right? Like, you all have lived through this. Like, you all know, like, that bad masters racer that comes up to you and like is in your face about 35th place. That's what they see as like being an official. And so one of the things that we are going to try and do in the Southeast is try to incentivize individuals to take that leap and do so, for 2 events. And if you like it and you stay with it, then we will incentivize you. And one of the ways that we've talked about doing that is working with some brand partners that we have to, to help them, kind of lower their barrier of entry to racing. And so for many kids, that's, bikes, equipment, clothing, and things like that. So one of the ways that we can, help them, because when you're in college, you don't have a ton of money, is if we can give them work with an industry partner to kind of get them, further into racing and support and feel supported by giving back, then maybe they'll look at that barrier a little bit differently. So that's the way we're looking at it.
And Nick, to follow up on that, I don't know if you've even been on the email chain, but I've committed that we're going to work to help subsidize the cost of entry for any enrolled collegiate athletes who want to be officials. So we're looking at providing their license for free, paying for their background check, and providing the first official shirt at least to help cover some of that cost. So we're working on that program.
I don't have an answer to the question, Chuck. That's awesome. But I do want to say, particularly, again, from the varsity perspective, one thing we take very seriously as a team is community engagement, right? So student athletes, school first, participation with the team and in bike racing second, and then a very close third, at least for us. And I think most of the other varsity teams operate this way too, is engagement with the community. So here at Marion, we operate a city park facility. So the students do a lot of work here. We're engaged with a couple fundraising efforts. We made a big push this year since there was no racing around Bike MS. We work directly with the junior team to advise them and coach them. I mean, we do a lot of those things. And I think most teams have some aspect of that. As Rachel said, oftentimes teams put on a bike race, not to put on a bike race, but to just have something happen for the conference, right? Everybody does it. So then there's a season that also might be a fundraiser for their club. I mean, so we push that engagement in community. And it's certainly a reminder to me that one thing we can do perhaps a little better is encourage some of that giving back to the community to be some of our riders promote the sport. And on the club varsity thing too, I mean, from a performance perspective, it's been one of my goals in my job to, when we go to national championships, from a operations perspective, right? The kids are treated like professionals. The students they get off the bus, they get on their bike, and they go ride just like at, a world tour event. And that's, from a performance perspective, is valid, but it's not necessarily in the spirit of this, all of this just happens for me. We all know that there's a lot of stuff that goes into producing bike race events. And so I appreciate the reminder to encourage collegiate riders to give back, and officiating is certainly one way.
The last thing that I had come through from Bonnie was just to cover briefly the category system within collegiate. So in collegiate, we use a letter category system at the current time, which is A through D for both men and women. Some conferences only have A and B, some have A through D, and actually even in the Eastern Conference, they do have an intro/E category. But when you look at those and compare them to the numeric categories that we use domestically, it's basically the exact same thing, with the understanding that a collegiate rider may never race a domestic race. So you could have a category A rider who is a Cat 5. That is completely possible because they've never done a public race. And if they never request the upgrade, they'll never be upgraded to that 1, 2, or 3. So just looking at it in that sense of, how would you work a 1-2 race versus a Cat 5/novice race? How would you work an A race compared to a D race? And just remember those as the comparison, and that you may never see that collegiate rider at a domestic race because they have no desire to. And then Chuck Winterberg, do moto officials work collegiate races? Yes, at the end of the day, it's the same thing as a grassroots race or a national level race. Just sometimes based on the LA, they may not actually assign them. There may not be motos available that weekend, but they should realistically be assigned the same way as a domestic race. Tony said licensing collegiate versus domestic. A change that we had, I believe in 2021, it may have started in 2020. The collegiate license, it used to be an add-on to the domestic license. So you used to have to buy one and then get the other added on. Now athletes can just buy the collegiate license and they're awarded domestic categories. Again, they have to be upgraded separately, but one license does afford them to race collegiate and domestic, unlike where it used to be in the past. A collegiate license would not allow a rider into a domestic race, where it does now because they are awarded that premium license that I believe we're calling it now. So I think that's it. That's all I had. We're about 5 minutes to the next topic. Want to again thank Michael, Rachel, and Nick for their time. This has been super helpful, super useful, and having the viewpoints of 3 very different people in the community has been awesome. So thanks, guys.
And I just want to thank all of you in the chat. I mean, I'm overwhelmed actually by the amount of officials who have chimed in and said collegiate is cool, or they've done stuff for collegiate. It's, as a team director, it's super awesome to see. Thank you all for that. And hopefully we'll run into many of you at races that we start attending very soon.
All right, and I want to add my thanks to Nick, Rachel, and Michael, not only for being on here, but for you all's contributions that you've made. I mean, it's especially for Rachel and Nick, it's an unpaid, thankless position. So thanks for taking some time on your Sundays and enjoy your weekend. So, excuse me, had to sneeze there. All right, I'm going to unspotlight you all. We've got our next presenter on. We're going to take just a 4-minute break, and I'm not even going to put the away slide up. And if anybody wants to chat, go ahead. If you need to run the restroom or grab something to drink or whatever, you got about 4 minutes to do so. And we'll see everybody back here. And thanks again, everyone.